Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Learn Live session. I'm Will Valida. I'm a customer engineer working in the Fast Track for Azure team based out of Auckland, New Zealand, here at Microsoft. And today we're going to be talking about how to choose an application modernization approach in Azure. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Satish. Satish, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Will. Hello, everybody. Again, I'm Satish, Senior Customer Engineer from Fast Track for Azure team, and I'm based out of Bangalore, India. Over to you, Will.
Awesome, cool. And we're joined today by our moderators. So say hi. We've got both Victor and Roman who also are in the Fast Track for Azure team. They'll be hanging out on the chat. So if you have any questions as we go through this, feel free to pop them in the chat wherever you're watching this session, and they'll be happy to answer your questions. Some of those questions may even be promoted to us while we're talking about the content that we're going to be presenting today. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat as well and keeping an eye out for questions that are promoted to the mainstream. Unfortunately, you won't be able to come off mute for this session. Traditionally, when Fast Track do these type of sessions, you're able to come off mute. So really, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll be happy to answer them. Now, just to explain, for those of you who don't know what Fast Track for Azure is, Fast Track for Azure is a customer-facing engineering group dedicated to working with organizations on their migrations and new solutions that they're building in Azure. We're not a sales team, nor are we a marketing team. So what we essentially do is we bring real-world technical experience working with hundreds of customers across the globe. And this kind of presentation that we're going to be delivering to you all today is a partnership with Microsoft Learn, and we've developed an official Learn collection on choosing your application modernization in Azure. So if you go to that URL up there, aka.ms/learnlive 2022-06-15, which is the date, B, you'll be able to follow along with the modules and resources that we've kind of collated as part of this collection. And throughout today's session, we'll be going through this collection. And towards the end of the session, we'll strongly encourage you to go and actually visit this link and use it for your reference, use it for your learning, and apply the knowledge that we're going to be talking about to your everyday work life. Cool. So we've got a lot of stuff to cover in today's session. Satish, why don't you kind of go through what are our learning objectives for this session today?
Sure, Will. Indeed. Yeah, so we would like to obviously go through what a typical migration journey look like, starting from planning and what exactly customer need to look at, right? So there are many things which are obvious and a lot of other things which are not obvious as well, right? So we would like to discuss what are the main factors which customer need to look at, and based on those factors, what are the migration approaches they can choose, maybe based on the time or the skill set, etc. Right? And we are going to see some of the standard migration patterns or reference architecture, which obviously our users can take away for them to explore and implement. So we might not go deep into each and every concepts there, but we are going to provide a high-level overview on how to approach the overall migration. Either it can be an infrastructure migration or a platform migration or etc. Right? So we are just going to give an overview on what are the tools we have and how should we approach.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, we prepared too much content. So essentially, the purpose of this is just to, like Satish said, go through a really high-level overview of these 3 learning objectives. And that will kind of prepare you to start going through the content that we've collated in that Learn collection. And then with these objectives in mind, you can actually apply that to your own situations, whether you're migrating your applications to Azure or you're modernizing your existing applications. So let's finish with this slide deck and go across to the actual collection that we've collated. So let's gracefully escape PowerPoint. So this is the collection that we've kind of created, working with myself, Victor, Satish, and Roman. So choosing your application modernization approach in Azure. So the kind of high-level stuff that we're going to be talking about today, we're going to start with understanding migration and your modernization approach. There are many benefits to moving your applications to Azure. And this is what we're going to be discussing, along with the tools that you can use to kind of optimize and assist you with your cloud journey. Then we're going to talk a little bit about rehosting, talking about different approaches to rehosting. So rehosting applications on Azure virtual machines, talking about infrastructure as a service or IaaS, and then designing your migration strategy to Azure. Then we're going to talk a little bit about refactoring, how we can actually host our applications on Azure App Service, and kind of discuss the basic reference architectures that we'd use for our applications. Satish, you want to talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss with re-architecting with containers and serverless?
Sure, Will. Yeah. So indeed, we have seen customers when they are trying to refactor, right? Obviously, they look at containers as an easy option as well. So we are going to look at basically what containers are and how to plan. That's one stuff. Another thing, obviously, right? We have seen most of the cases where customer migrate from on-prem monolithic to cloud, and in most cases they modernize the application with microservices architecture as well. So that's why we are going to look at what a typical microservice architecture look like, and what are the things which customer need to do versus not do, and how to plan exactly the microservice architecture compared to traditional monoliths.
Awesome. Then we'll go into discussing serverless as an option. So we'll introduce very quickly what serverless architecture is and what serverless means. Then we'll look at how you can actually plan building your applications using serverless technology, involving different stakeholders, helping your team skill up so they actually know how to develop applications on serverless, security concerns, factors like that. Then we'll go through some reference architectures as well. And then finally, we'll talk about different integration services, particularly focusing on different types of messaging and message brokers that you can use in Azure, and also choosing an appropriate data storage approach when thinking about data storage for your applications. Cool. So let's get started with understanding the migration and modernization approach. So essentially, when we're thinking about modernizing our applications into Azure, we have to kind of think about the benefits and what's driving us to move our applications to Azure. Like, these things happen for a reason. We don't just do it for the sake of it. And it's important to understand what are the benefits of actually moving our existing applications to Azure. What are the phases and what are the steps that we need to take to migrate our applications, and how that looks like in our modernization journey. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about the migration tools and modernization tools available that will actually help you successfully move your applications to Azure. So lots of organizations are actually interested in moving to the cloud, but it's always a good idea to have an idea of what the benefits of this actually are. Moving to the cloud is a bit of a shift in how we actually purchase our systems, how we design our systems, deploy them, and secure them. And it's important as developers, solution architects, and business decision makers that we understand what the benefits of the cloud are so we can align them to our business and technical goals. So the cloud kind of benefits us in multiple different ways. It can help us optimize costs, build resiliency and security. We can have a little bit of flexibility and how we move our applications. We have a lot more control in terms of scaling and how we can actually handle different workloads on demand. And it helps us to innovate faster using a managed platform, so we can just focus on developing our code and providing features that provide business value to our users. So when it comes to optimizing costs, on-premise data centers are expensive. We have to think about real estate so we can actually have somewhere to put our data center, the power so we can power them up, the servers, the storage and the networks, the physical components that actually make up our data center, and then operations staff that we would employ to kind of make sure that our on-prem environments are ticking over nicely and operating efficiently. And these all affect our bottom line. When we think about modernizing our workloads and migrating to Azure, essentially what we do is we're converting upfront capital expenditures to operating expenditures that are paid over time. So rather than paying for everything upfront and trying to estimate how much capital expenditure we need to spend in order to satisfy our demand, we can shift this to operating expenditures, and this can change over time, and it allows us to be a lot more flexible, achieve more cost savings, and drive a little bit of efficiency as well. Now, resiliency and security are the core tenets of the Azure cloud. Unlike a lot of other public cloud providers, data that will traverse within our or between our Azure data centers doesn't go through the public internet. It stays within Microsoft's network. And the reliability and performance of cloud services is really determined in part by the network, and in addition to having more data center regions than any other cloud providers, because the Microsoft network is one of the largest in the world.
So just want to call out, Will. Yeah, so obviously when it comes to reliability, right, we obviously talk about the network stability as well. And other thing is how exactly the infrastructure is spread out, right? Whether we have the right reliability in place. That means that hosted in multiple regions close to the users, etc. Right? So certainly the number of regions which have plays an important role as well. So I just want to call out that as well.
No, that's a real good call out. We also have a lot of flexibility in terms of hybrid workloads. You may find that your organization isn't required or can't move everything at once. So we have that ability to have both an on-prem environment and an Azure environment running side by side. And we could also help us with scaling our applications and workload on demand. So like I said, rather than worrying about capital expenditure upfront, we can start thinking about operating expenditure and only pay for the amount of resource that you're using when you're using it and when you need it. Cool. So turning into the Azure migration and modernization drivers, Satish, what are the kind of like common drivers that you see when you're working with your customers and working with engineers when they're considering migrating and modernizing their applications on Azure?
Indeed, there are multiple factors I at least came across, Will. So first thing is that, right, customers, when they launch new products or projects, right, so that's when they sometimes come up with a greenfield approach where they have the flexibility to, say, for example, pick the right technology or whatnot, right? So that's one. But most of the scenarios, customer start with what they have in on-prem. So that means that they already have an existing workload which they need to move to cloud, and multiple reasons there. So one might be they might be already in their own data center, or maybe they might be hosted in some partner data center as well, and there might be a renewal time period coming in, maybe for hardware refresh or the new contract extension with the partner. And that might be one of the critical time for them to move immediately to the cloud, and they don't have too much flexibility at that point from the timeline perspective as well. So that's common scenario. And other one is obviously when we have license renewal or end of life scenarios, like maybe Oracle renewal or something coming in, and they weigh in the cost benefit with multiple providers, and they decided maybe this might be a right time to move from on-prem to cloud and migrate it to some other platform as well. So that's also another common scenario I come across. And obviously, like sometimes they don't properly utilize their infrastructure, right? For example, like you rightly called out the capital expenditure in on-prem, where they pay upfront, but most of maybe 50% of their data center capacity is unused, and that might be a good point to consolidate everything. And maybe instead of keeping that running, maybe they look at cloud as an option to consolidate, where they can have the option to maybe switch off some of the dev test workload when not in use. So basically, consolidation and cost savings is another major benefit as well. And other scenario sometimes is maybe their business might be growing so fast, and they need to their IT team need to support new business requirements as well. And if you look at the same capital expenditure cycle, it roughly, I mean, takes multiple weeks or even multiple months to procure the new hardware and install everything in their data center and give the right capacity to the team. So, and this is one of the reason where whenever they want to innovate with new product, maybe they just try Azure. And in most cases, it's very beneficial for the customer. The reason being that sometimes they might not know whether this will be successful or not, and they might be just giving it a try, and having a huge investment upfront might not make sense when customers are unsure whether this will work or not. So there are multiple drivers, I would say, but yeah, so these are the major ones I usually encounter.
Yeah, I think what you just trying to call out what you're saying. Um, I think there are two different approaches when we think about cloud and migration versus modernization. So when we have IT based triggers, we would usually opt for migration of our workloads. However, if the purpose for for moving to Azure is more business orientated, that's more, we'd recommend more modernizing your applications to enable that faster time to market and increase that innovation so you can actually drive those business benefits towards your customers, which is the primary reason we would modernize our application.
Yeah, completely agree
Well,
with you, Ray.
awesome. So when we think about kind of our cloud journey and how we can actually divide that into phases, um, it's not just as simple as saying, hey, this is our application, let's go and stick it in Azure. There's a little bit more nuance required to this. It involves organizational change, process change, and technology change. And working with customers and also working in other organizations, this can be a very difficult thing to navigate. But by taking a holistic approach, this actually helps you and navigate the journey successfully and ensure that when we're moving to the cloud, we actually recognize that, realize those benefits, including increased efficiency, agility, and actually deploying our applications and being able to scale a lot easier once our workloads are running in the cloud. And we can really define this in kind of three phases. So we've got planning, implementation, and then operations. So when you're planning your cloud migration and modernization journey, it's really essential to kind of align stakeholders across your organization to ensure that you're all on the same page. By being able to define that strategy, saying why we're going to be moving to the cloud, and make sure that you have that common alignment across your organization is really critical in order to make sure that you're planning a successful adoption of Azure. And then once you've got your strategy in mind, you can plan and discover and assess your environment, build a business case around why you're moving to Azure. Again, we don't do these things because, it's just cool and we just want to deploy stuff to the cloud and make things go whiz and bang. There has to be a business case behind it. There has to be a reason why we're doing it so we can provide value to our customers. Do you have any thoughts on planning your cloud migration and modernization journey, Satish?
Yeah, obviously, will. When we talk about the overall cloud adoption framework, right? It's looking at an enterprise level overall cloud strategy. So it's not specific to individual projects or products. So I mean, there are multiple things which an organization need to plan, right? So particularly around the resources, whether we have the right set of cloud resources in place, whether we need to go for new hiring, or whether we need to go for a partner to complete that migration. Maybe if we don't have this skill set, does it mean that we have alternate route, etc., right? So that obviously includes, I mean, one is from the resource perspective and another from the technology perspective. Does it serve well for another maybe next 5 years or so, or whether we are investing in a legacy technology going forward? So technology is another thing as well. And third thing
Yeah.
is that how much does it cost for this overall cloud adoption, right? It's not about an individual project level, but how much the CTO is going to spend from the company's pocket, right? And does it make sense from the TCO perspective? So total cost of operations compared to what we are running, and yeah, all those factors weigh in during the plan stage as well. And once customers see a clear benefit and less friction, that's when like yeah, so they will go towards other ready and adapt steps in that.
Yeah, that's really true what you said about the CTOs and technical business decision makers. They need to take a holistic view rather than just focusing on a project at a time. I've been involved in organizations in the past where we would try something as a proof of concept or a POC, and that would be very specific to our team. And then as we go further down the line, we're getting a little bit of success, a little bit of traction within our cloud journey. All of a sudden, we're now responsible for kind of like the organizational adoption for the cloud, which as a small development team is a little bit, it's out of scope of what they're supposed to be doing. So as part of planning and implementing your migration and modernization journey, there does have to be a lot of care taken to how you're going to govern cloud usage within your organization. So what kind of standards you're going to be using, what guardrails are you going to be implementing to ensure that people are using the cloud properly and securely, and just like you said, making sure it doesn't cost too much, and doing some budget tracking to kind of assess their spend on Azure. Cool.
Yeah. So another call out, Will, just
Yeah.
want to clarify, because during this migration, right, it might easily take a few months to years sometimes, like if it is a very huge organization with multiple departments and whatnot, right? It spans sometimes to 1 year or so as well, right? So during this migration phase, customer end up running something on Azure, and they don't just shut down everything immediately on on-prem as well. So our customer need to understand there might be some time overlap where they might spend resources both in cloud and on-prem. So that means that initial cost might a little bit shoot up. But when we are evaluating the overall cloud journey, right? So we should consider like your overall time frame. Say, for example, what is the total TCO for next 3 years or 5 years, and how much are we going to save? Because when
That's true.
customer think about short-term thing, obviously there might be some higher cost involved as well, but that's not the right metrics to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk about some of the kind of like migration patterns and strategies that we can use when we're migrating our solutions to the cloud. So the kind of four broad patterns that we can use within our well, four broad patterns that we can use to migrate our applications to the cloud. So we've got rehost, refactor, re-architecture, or rebuild. And as we're going through the different technologies throughout this session, we'll cover this more in detail. But just from a very high level, if we take in a rehost approach, this is often referred to as kind of a lift and shift migration, which doesn't really require any code changes. Essentially, it allows us to migrate our applications to Azure very, very quickly. Each application is migrated as is to kind of get the benefits of the cloud straight up without the risk and cost associated that we need to take on if we need to make changes to our code. There's refactoring. So we'll talk a little bit how we can refactor our applications using containers and serverless technologies. And this is often referred to as repackaging. Essentially, this requires minimal changes to our applications so they can essentially work with Azure Platform as a Service or PaaS offerings. So taking examples, Satish, I think later we'll be talking about how we can migrate existing applications to either App Service or Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS. Or we could potentially refactor relational and non-relational databases using options as SQL Managed Instance, database for MySQL, or Cosmos DB. And then re-architecting. So essentially, this would focus on modifying and extending our application and the code base to optimize our architecture to scale in the cloud. So what would be a good example of that, Satish?
Yeah, so indeed, if a customer is starting something as a cloud native, right? So that might be a good point to look at rebuilding from the scratch, because customer has that flexibility to choose the technology, and they don't have the legacy burden as well. So that's when, like, certainly some of the re-architect and rebuild will overlap in that, right? Whether they throw everything and start new, or whether they are modernizing some of the components, etc. So it depends on where exactly the customer is starting from. So yeah, it varies based on different customer situations as well.
Yeah, totally.
Not
And
a
then
single right or wrong.
No, that's very true. It's these kind of approaches are more kind of these patterns. Sorry, are guidelines. It does, like you said, differ a lot on your current situation and what your application requirements are. Totally. And then rebuild. The final pattern, rebuild. This takes things a little bit further by actually rebuilding an application from scratch using Azure Cloud technologies. So I've seen teams who are developing applications on-prem using BizTalk, and they've essentially rewritten their applications using cloud-native technologies such as Azure Functions and Azure Cosmos DB. And that just kind of takes things a little bit further by completely starting from scratch.
Yeah,
Cool.
good
So
call out, Will. Just one thing I just want to highlight again is that while we talk about 4 Rs now, obviously the rehost, rebuild, etc., right? So there
yeah,
is fifth one we usually say, obviously as part of the 5 Rs of rationalization, which is replace. And that's, for example, right, customer might have some stuff running on, but there might be readily available replacement in the market, and in this case it doesn't make sense to migrate everything, and there are scenarios where they can directly sign up for those software as a service platform. So one good example might be, maybe customer might have their own SMTP or SMS servers on-prem, but going forward in the cloud they can just sign up for maybe some SMS gateways, which is cloud native, for example, Twilio or whatnot, right? So that's a another phase which, so which doesn't focus too much on the cloud migration itself, but replaces one thing where it makes sense in some places.
awesome. Cool. So let's kind of wrap this part of the talk by talking about some of the tools that are available to us to actually support our migrations and modernizations to Azure. So the first one right off the list is the Cloud Adoption Framework, otherwise referred to the CAF. This is a collection of documentation, some implementation guidance, best practices, and tools that we've created to help you accelerate your cloud adoption journey. It's designed to help you create and implement the business and technology strategies necessary for your organization to succeed in the cloud. So, Satish, can you talk about, just very generically, obviously we don't want to expose any NDA, but can you talk about how you've any customer situations where you've used the CAF to help them with their cloud journeys?
Indeed, many times will. Yes, while we will not call out the specific customers, but there are repeatable scenarios we have, and most of the time, customer come to us and say that, hey, I have a few business driver in place, and obviously the technical drivers where I need to move to cloud, but I don't know how. Maybe you can help with that. And when we have a deeper conversation with them, right? Most of the time we understood that they have something in mind. They have seen somewhere or read somewhere that cloud has a good TCO and all the benefits like agility, faster time to market, or whatnot, right? But
Yeah.
they don't exactly know how to achieve those benefits, right? They from
Right.
their perspective, most of the time it might be few applications where maybe they need to redeploy. So that might be a simple mindset in most of the cases as well. But that's when we ask detailed questions around, hey, when you talk about cloud, is it cloud only approach, or is it a hybrid strategy, right? So
Right.
whether you are even having a multi-cloud approach as well. If that's the case, what are the common baseline you want to implement across all the providers, right? And what are some of the common governance things which you keep in mind? For example, if you have a single on-prem environment, you have a homogeneous environment that you can use some set of tools which you can monitor. But when you extend your environment to Azure, what are the governance challenges you might come in, right? So
Right.
from those perspective, right? So customers, I mean, really struggle a lot, and that's when this cloud adoption framework provides an end-to-end like. I mean, framework around where they need to start, what are the stuff they need to look at from the strategy perspective, and once they uh, have the right justification and business outcome defined, so that's when like, hey, how exactly are we going to plan? So yeah, so sometime back we touched upon like skilling perspective, TCO, and all those stuff, right? Whether partner, etc. So providing a framework helps you a lot in navigating with the right steps, and it also like serve as a good checklist so that they don't miss anything and identify at later stages. So one example might be, right, sometimes when customers start with a POC environment, they might not have all the governance control in place, but when they
Right.
try to convert it into a production, obviously there needs to be an enterprise level governance practices in place. And most of the cases, like without a cloud adoption framework, customer end up just renaming the environment as a production, and I have seen those type of scenarios as well, and that's when I specifically called out, hey, that's not the right way to do, and there are some proper planning which we need to do when we look at an enterprise level, either from the security perspective or the visibility perspective or whatnot, right? So certainly cloud adoption framework provides the guardrails around what they need to do without missing any of the important steps.
Right. So just a quick question, and as I move on with the cloud adoption framework, do you find that some customers and engineers they'll build a PSC application and they won't really, or they might not be aware of the cloud adoption framework, or they won't really follow it, and you find that this kind of framework, or this framework helps guide them to building successful deployments, or do you find that most engineers are reading this ahead of time, they understand the framework quite well, and that kind of sets them up for success?
It is the first case most of the time.
Right.
Customers start with something and they don't know exactly, I mean, about this framework when they start fresh. But when they come to us, when they are ready for, I mean, deploying at scale at an enterprise level, so that's when like we most of the time call out that, hey, this is something have you looked at? From whatever you have done, I see these are the stuff missing, right? So you need to
Right.
plan towards this stuff as well, and that's why maybe this is a good call out for everyone listening in to have a basic understanding of cloud adoption framework. Again, the intent is not to understand end to end or memorize end to end, but you need to know there is something called cloud adoption framework which will help you, that will provide some of the guardrails, and it's not mandatory to apply everything at the initial stage. Maybe you don't need to overcomplicate your POC, but that should be options where you can easily plug in this as well. For example, right? When you think of POC, you don't need to implement end-to-end governance practices in place, but you need to foresee what are the governance practices which I need to bring in. For example, when I move it to production. So yeah, those thought process should really help, and that's why we just want to call out. This is something you need to at least have a look at it before migrating to cloud.
Awesome. I'm just going to just really cover the rest of the tools at a very high level. So we've also have Azure Migrate. Essentially, this is a hub that we use for cloud migration services and tools to discover and really assess the workloads that we can actually migrate to the cloud. We can also use Azure Database Migration Service, which will help you automate and kind of guide your database migration to Azure. So you might have some on-premise environments and databases that you're using in your current architecture. And we can use Azure Database to just try and kind of simplify the process of migrating those databases to Azure. We also have Azure App Service migration as well. And this helps you bring your web apps to the cloud without with even no code changes or minimal code changes. And this is a tool that we use to migrate .NET applications from on-prem into the cloud automatically. We also have a smart tool, which is kind of like a strategic tool that you can actually use to help prepare your Azure migration. And this helps you with business planning, training, security, and governance. And also there's cloud economics tools as well, because it's an important business decision, not just a technical decision. And what Microsoft has done, we've released a cloud economics guidance and offerings, which will help you understand your cloud investment with some detailed financial analysis up front. But turning our attention to modernizing your applications, Azure specifically offers a number of ways to actually host our code. And we refer to this as compute, which is essentially the hosting model for computing resources that your application runs on. And we have this neat little flowchart that we kind of use and direct customers and engineers towards when they're thinking about picking a compute service. And we ask questions like, are you building something new, or are you migrating? Maybe you're doing a bit of a lift and shift. If you can't containerize your applications, maybe you're going to deploy them or lift and shift your applications onto virtual machines. If you don't require full control, and you're looking at some high performance computing, you can use something like Azure Batch. If you're building microservices, you can look towards Azure Functions, container instances if you don't need any orchestration, or even Azure Container Apps, which weren't generally available at build. Or if you don't need microservices architecture, not everything needs microservices, you can look to deploy your applications on Azure App Service as well. Satish, do you have any comments on this flowchart?
Good call out, Will. Indeed, this is where most of the customer, struggle a lot. The reason being that we have variety of services on cloud, and each does different things. And I have seen scenarios where if customer teams are comfortable with any of the technology, for example, Java-based technology, and they are comfortable with Azure Spring Cloud, right? And they pick Spring Cloud for everything. That's not the ideal way to go. There might be even just a simple app which even don't need that complex infrastructure as well. So there are multiple services which we need to look at. And again, this is a good call out to decide on where exactly customer need to look at. Again, it's not the final thing or something set in stone, but this gives a great guidelines on what exactly they need to look at before choosing a particular Azure service from the technical perspective.
Right. Cool. So we've kind of gone through in detail what we need to understand when it comes to approaching our migration and modernization approach for our applications. So Satish, when we talk about rehosting our applications, what should I be thinking about? Say I'm a developer or a solution architect, and thinking of rehosting my applications. What should I be thinking about?
Few things will. First is like as you rightly pointed out during the introduction. Obviously, like Rehost involves lift and shift. I mean that means that whatever they have running on-prem, they are trying to replicate it on Azure. um, uh, Again, there are multiple business drivers for that, as we discussed earlier as well. When there are new business growth coming in, and they don't have the I mean capacity in the data center, that might be a good reason that they just want to extend their workloads, maybe to Azure, right? Some of them might be
Right.
already running in on-prem, and some of the newer workloads they might want to host in Azure. And obviously, there might be connectivity between these two, which they might require. And uh, most of the times, yes, it's the timing which makes sense as well. If, say, for example, customer don't have luxury in modernizing or changing the code, the easiest approach is that uh, just migrate everything as is on cloud. That means that on your virtual machine, right? So
Right.
there are few advantages with this approach. For example, when customer starts migrating to a new platform, that's already a larger change. And second thing is, um, uh, again, there shouldn't be too much moving parts as well. So if when, say, for example, we want to modernize some of this stuff, right? Code change, and again a new platform, then um, if there are issues, right, customer will not be able to understand where exactly they got stuck. Is it because of the platform, or is it because of the new changes as well, right?
Right.
So that's why if they don't want to have any risk in the migration, which with shorter timelines, that's when ideally they need to look at Rehost. And exactly, I mean, there are obviously like this is a fictional scenario, and a small application called Smart Hotel 360, which talks about like typical .NET application, your .NET front end, which is running on your VM.
Right.
On-prem, it's a VMware application. The thing is that, right, we are trying to tie up everything, like how the business driver align with the migration goals, and what's the proposed architecture which we are going to look for this application, right? Again, the main key point here is that customer doesn't want to change anything. They just want to host somewhere else for some of the immediate benefit, maybe the cost or agility or whatnot, right? So
Right.
this is one of the places where customer usually start because they might realize immediate benefit as well. What's your thought on that? Will do you see more rehost project for new customers, or what's the trend you are seeing?
So what I'm when I observe the rehost kind of projects that I'm involved in, it's really driven by those business decision makers. It differs between, I'll be honest, reluctancy to move to the cloud because their applications are working normally and as expected. So they want to ensure that their applications are stable, and it's between that and also they want to realize the business benefits and limit the amount of risk involved. Because moving to the cloud, if you don't do it carefully and properly, it can introduce a lot of risk into your architecture. So I do see those kind of business drivers influencing those rehost applications or rehost scenarios. Sorry.
Got you, Will. And obviously, like whatever we spoke is pretty evident, right? So those are the functional requirements, but most of the time there are a lot of non-functional requirements, or in short, NFRs, which might play a role. And coming to this specific example, right? Obviously, like customer obviously want better performance, at least the same, if not better, right? So
Yeah.
performance is something which we usually miss out, and uh, at the end of the migration, right, customer might not have the right benchmark already in place, so they might say that, hey, I moved to cloud, but my my performance is not good. There may be variety of reasons, and that's why it's always good to have a well-defined non-functional requirements that include performance and other factors as well. Again, migration goals should obviously include those non-functional requirement as well. For example, right, when I move to cloud, nothing should break. So that's obviously a migration goals as well, right? And other thing, sometimes customer might have their own operational team already set up, well established process which works well for them. So they might want to have that continue for a while they are moving into cloud, and that might be a good reason that they just look at consuming some of the virtual machine on cloud and continue to use the same process and tools they have, right? Because if they look at other cloud native services, there might be change in how a lot of stuff operate, right? From the responsibility perspective, whether they have the higher control versus low control, and etc. Right? So this is one good reason as part of the migration goal. And specifically, when we talk about control versus flexibility, Rehost falls extreme left, where we have full control of the underlying infrastructure, OS, and whatever we host on top of that. But we as a customer have the responsibility to host it well. When I say well, obviously, all the factors, either it can be reliability or hosted with the right performance tweaking, whether to secure it right. So everything is part of the customer responsibility. Whereas if you look at other platform services, obviously there is a shared responsibility model in the cloud. So yeah, so some of the migration goals I would like to call out here.
No, that's really important, because if you have those goals in mind, it really drives, okay, how are we going to host our applications? What kind of responsibility we're taking on board as well? I see a lot of engineers and customers really struggle to understand where their responsibility is in their hands, or where the responsibility is in Microsoft's hands. So it's really important to really kind of have those migration goals in mind, and that can really drive what you're trying to achieve in your migration to Azure.
Got you, Will. Yeah, so this typical example architecture, right? So this is currently, I mean, a fictional scenario hosted on-prem on VMware. So, I mean, obviously, you can go through in detail on individual steps, like whether they have a separate web tier, database tier, etc. Right? So,
Right.
but coming to this proposed architecture, right? So this is one of the typical example we have. So whenever customer look at infrastructure as a service, right? Usually they will have to migrate stuff from on-prem. So that means that they need to establish some of the connectivity, and before establishing that, right, they need to define, I mean, the right network address space on the cloud, and design the right VNet, subnet, etc. Right, and then they have to
Right.
establish the right connectivity, and that's what we usually call it as landing zone. Indeed, landing zone covers a lot of stuff. Obviously, networking is one major important thing, but other stuff like governance, monitoring, maybe right naming conventions, tagging practices, all those stuff come under those landing zone, right? So when
And these
we
cut, and sorry to cut across, but these cut across different environments as well. So what's necessarily we use in our dev environment, we're not using in our production environment. There are different levels depending on the environment that we're actually going to be using in our application architecture.
completely agree on that, Will. Indeed, say for example, right, the level of security and monitoring might be much more higher in production, and for example, usage of multiple firewalls, maybe to filter north-south versus east-west traffic as well, right? And
Yeah.
maybe when it is a POC environment, it's a complete sandbox where teams are, I mean, allowed to play around with that. But when it comes to production or critical environments, obviously they will have stringent controls as well, which is part of the landing zone.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah. So again, once the landing zone is in place, maybe a typical entire architecture is what this example is talking about, right? So obviously there is a web VM which is hosted as is on the cloud. So that means that like in on-prem they already have that VM and they migrate it on cloud on top of VM. And similarly, obviously, like if they have a SQL Server on VM, maybe they can leverage some of the tools as well, SQL migration assistance or whatnot, right? And have an evaluation on what would be the best approach, right? And
Right.
maybe this fictional scenario is decided on the SQL VM as well. So, Will, what are the other approaches you see when it comes to lift and shift migration? Is there a scenario where some of those can be easily uh, looked into platform services as well, where there is a mix and match uh, possibility?
Well, I have seen some scenarios where customers will essentially they'll be running these legacy applications, so .NET framework applications, and try to containerize them and just either or containerize them and deploy them to Kubernetes with Windows containers, or just deploy them to virtual machines. And you do see a lot of those projects where they're trying to get immediate value of going to the cloud without not giving the proper consideration to how their landing zones are going to work, how their applications are going to perform. So all of the guiding principles that you've discussed here are really important to call out, because we do see a lot of engineers struggle just by assuming, okay, lift and shift is just taking this application, sticking it in the cloud, where it's not as simple as that.
Good call out, Will. Indeed, other scenario sometimes we encounter is that, right, while customer want to keep that lift and shift as is, right, sometimes it makes sense to maybe just move only the database to a SQL database or something like that, where I mean they achieve some of the immediate benefits like high availability and better reliability or whatnot, right? But from the code change perspective, they are not changing anything, because like they're just pointing to the connection string. Only thing is that the database migration, and if there isn't any challenges with the compatibility, maybe that's one of the option which yeah, we usually see as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, so there are pros and cons. Again, we have discussed already in detail, but when we talk about a typical migration, obviously we spoke about a cloud adoption framework as well. But in simple terms, obviously we have to have a preparatory phase on the migration, and preparatory phase involves certainly like getting the right inventory in place. Obviously, some of those cases, right? Customer don't know what they have in on-prem, but they want to migrate to cloud, right? So,
Yeah.
if that's the case, what are the tools which we have in place, and how to discover those, and what it takes to use those tools, right? Sometimes we have seen customers say no when if we want to try to install something as part of their environment, for example, based on agent discovery, etc. So that's why we need to have a clear understanding on the tool set, and once we have the right inventory in place, then the migration approach as well. So what do you think, Will, about agent versus agent-based migration, and what's the customer's preference when you see, for example, the discovery part?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I kind of lost you there for a second.
Yeah, so specifically, we have those agent-based discovery and agentless discovery, right? So sometimes customer say no when we try to do an agent-based discovery. The reason being that, hey, no, we don't want to install any extra agent in part of that environment. Is it the same trend you are seeing in your typical customer projects as well? So just want to hear from you.
Yes, I have seen a little bit of that in some of my projects. They essentially just want to keep their migration strategy as simple as possible. So, like I said, they'll be moving those applications straight onto those VMs, and they won't consider what else is really required. So we do see some engineers who don't kind of fully appreciate what else is involved in their lift and shift migrations.
Got you, Will. Yeah. Uh, yes, coming to this specific scenario, right? Obviously, there is a preparatory phase where that I mean, if it is based on VMware environment, right? So there is a VMware based discovery where we need to set up some prerequisites, and then once it's there, obviously, like we can start the discovery as well. So I'll leave it to you to go ahead and explore. We just want to give you a high level what steps involved here, and the takeaway here is that you go ahead and try it out. And obviously, few things to note. There might be some of the connectivity required to access these agents. So when you are trying to use this migration approach in your on-prem environment, you might need to have a conversation with your networking and firewall team as well, and make them understand why you need this connectivity and to enable this migration.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Just keeping an eye on the time. So we've kind of discussed rehosting our applications. Should we now move on to how we can actually refactor our applications and talk about those scenarios?
Indeed. Yes. So uh, obviously we talk about the lift and shift approach, right? Where we need to have 100% compatibility as is. But the other scenario which we would like to say, for example, highlight to the customer is that there are other options in the cloud as well. For example, right, when we move from infrastructure as a service to the platform as a service, there are some immediate benefits which we have. One example might be, right, if we are directly hosting some of the HTTP based workloads, we can think of hosting something on an app service as well. Well, app service is just a managed web app hosted on Azure. Um, uh, and the advantage is that when we refer to platform as a service, the customer don't have the overhead of maintaining the virtual machine. Customer is going to pay for what they consume from the compute capacity perspective. So they just pay for maybe 2 core and 4 gig RAM capacity, but I'm not going to manage that host OS, etc. Right? And other
Right.
good point is that yeah, sometimes customer don't have the complete overhead of patching and all the recurring maintenance stuff as well. So, what do you think will maybe if customer has different, um, I mean, technologies in place, maybe they're scattered around like legacy .NET versus the latest .NET 6 or whatnot, right? And if they have multiple technologies like Python, Ruby, or whatnot, right? So, uh, but does it make sense to move to app service versus VM? Just want to check where do customers usually lean towards this app service model versus infra model?
Well, with virtual machines, what you have to realize is there's a lot of management overhead. So it may sound simple to just take your existing on-prem applications and deploy them to a virtual machine. But with virtual machines in Azure, you have full control over them. And that brings in operational complexity, such as patching the virtual machine, making sure it's secure, that it's not accessible outside of your network. So if you need that control, then by all means, go ahead and deploy your applications to virtual machines. But one of the beauties with the PaaS model is we can actually Microsoft takes care of that for you. And what Azure App Service does, it provides you with compute where you can deploy your web applications or web applications without having to worry about the operational overhead of what a virtual machine will the kind of operational overhead that causes.
Good call out, Will. So most of the time, right, there is a common misconception that whenever we say that, hey, are you looking at Azure App Service or other platform as a service, right? So customer say that, hey, I don't have control on what's happening there, right? So that's a, I mean, misconception I would really say. The reason being that the level of control obviously varies to some extent, but there are ways which we can control what's happening inside, right? Only thing is
Right.
that the traditional way might not work. There might be new tools and instrumentation which might need customer might need to do. So it's not as simple as I don't have the control when we move to platform as a service, right?
Right.
And obviously we support a mix of technologies as well. Either if we want to host it based on Linux or Windows platform, or any of the major framework. But uh, it in most cases, right, increases the developer velocity. The reason being that some of the application, right, might have the predefined templates as well. For example, if we want to host some of the WordPress or whatnot, right, we don't need to build everything from scratch. We can just have them
Yeah.
readily available templates, and we can just host it as well. So just want to highlight few of those as well.
Awesome.
And just coming to DevOps, Will, what do you think uh, the role of DevOps and platform services in general, and how exactly you feel that it accelerate the overall development cycle?
Well, DevOps really kind of helps us to kind of simplify the deployment of our applications to PaaS services. So when I think about tools like Azure DevOps, which is a tool which is separate from DevOps, but it helps enables DevOps. It allows developers to kind of host their or yeah, kind of have a central repository for their code for their different applications. They can use pipelines to help build and deploy those applications, and they can within those pipelines they can create controls. They can put in deployment checks and just provide some quality assurance around how they're deploying their applications to Azure. We do see a lot of customers ask questions and still still at the very infancy stage of their DevOps journey. So when we think about deploying Azure App Services, we really encourage engineers and customers to kind of embrace DevOps as a way to test their code, make sure that it's performing as expected through integration tests. We also ensure that it performs well using performance tests, and it kind of combines the process of developers working off their application and code, and also business decision makers and business analysts providing that kind of business visibility of the products that they're developing through Kanban boards and Scrum boards, stuff like that, to help application teams deploy their applications quickly to Azure.
Good,
So
good
it's
call out, Will. Yeah,
yeah,
thanks for that. And indeed, right, when we talk about app service or other platform services, right? So obviously we talk about scaling as an important, I mean, feature, right? And
yeah,
when we talk about scaling in traditional on-prem world, it's like maybe increasing the capacity of the server, right? So
yeah,
that's what we usually refer as uh, scale up. Whereas in cloud, we I mean, there is a physical limit on how much we can scale up, and if we want to scale infinite, we need to, I mean, have a mechanism to add more instances and spread the load across using some load balancing technique or whatnot, right? So that's a
yeah,
common pattern which we see in the cloud. Yeah, scale out versus scale up, always a debate when we migrate traditional application. But this is something would like to call out, like auto scaling feature is something like where we don't even need to uh, I mean know what will be the load. We can just enable the scaling based on how much the requests come in, right? So
yeah.
uh,
Because in an
few
on-prem world, it's difficult to keep buying machines just to try and scale up. Whereas with the cloud, you essentially have your credit card and a slider bar, and you can scale up as much as you scale as much as you like. But I'm obviously joking a little, but it's a lot easier to actually auto scale your workloads in Azure, which is the point you're making.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so before we move further, right, I just want to call out a few stuff for again misconception. When customers say that, hey, we are going with a PaaS or app service model, right? They usually think it's a multi-tenant model. Indeed, there are options to host it in your, own VNet, injected scenario versus VNet integrated scenario. There are right security controls in place. So, uh, 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 just going to pass might expose my data with other customers is a common misconception as well. So
Right.
yeah, and other than that, yes, it's not just for hosting only the web application. We can obviously host majority of the web application as well. But if you have an API backend which you want to host, obviously, like if it's not a traditional microservices approach, um, uh, maybe like you can host a simple API backend as well. And indeed, if we have mobile backend as well, obviously these are some of the good candidates to go into the app service model. So yeah, so that's what I want to call out. But before moving on, Will, do you have anything else which you specifically point out when customer look at app service?
Just following on from your point, it's good to consider these things as part of a whole, right? So our application architecture isn't just going to be app service. We're going to have to think, how are we going to secure traffic coming into our application? Do we need to deploy it within a VNet? How are we going to manage secrets as well? Oh, do we need a service like Azure Key Vault to store our secrets securely, to ensure that connection strings, for example, to databases aren't going to be compromised? If we're building APIs, can we use something like APIM to control how our APIs are exposed, how they implement policies to ensure that we don't get too many requests coming into our APIs? So it's really important when we think about app service, it's a part of a whole. So what other services do we need to ensure that our applications are scalable and secure and resilient?
Thank you, Will. Yeah, so this Learn Live module obviously talk about how you can deploy an app service and how to, deploy your code and how you can use your IDE, etc. So feel free to go through that. There are detailed steps on how to create from Azure portal, etc. Right? So I'll leave it to you to explore. Again, typical reference architecture. Where we can see like common patterns like leveraging key vault as Will called out, right? And there are certain deployment best practices like leveraging deployment slots and some patterns around using platform-based databases as well. So
I love deployment slots. What I really like when I'm engaging with engineers, they're actually leveraging those deployment slots, so they have a production and a staged a slot when they're doing blue-green deployments. Perhaps they're doing canary releases as well. It's good to see that there are engineers utilizing deployment slots to kind of manage their deployments and test their code within different environments. And that's where the power of DevOps can come in as well. So by using those two in combination, you can actually increase the quality of your deployments really effectively. It's a really powerful tool. I just wanted to call that out.
thanks you, Will, for that. Let's move on to re-architect. Again, containers is one approach. Obviously, serverless will certainly will touch upon later. But yeah, I would like to start with some of the microservices architecture. A customer usually talk about and some of the things which we need to look at and misconception as well, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so when customer usually talk about microservices, right? They hear that microservices scales well. They read somewhere that yeah, it's resilient, fault isolation. It's like you can deploy individually, etc. Right? So obviously they get carried away with all these benefits. But what's the downside of this, Will? What do you think is something which customer need to look at and balance whether they need to go to a microservices architecture or not?
When approaching microservices, it's very easy to get wrapped up in the idea that every small bit of code, a part of our monolith, can be broken up into microservices. It's always important when we're designing microservices architecture to really think about the domain in which they're going to be operating in. Successful microservices architecture that I've seen, they're really wrapped around domain. So purchasing, ordering, stuff like that, rather than specific technologies. I think if you focus too much from a technology base on your microservices, you can end up with thousands and thousands of services within your architecture. They're difficult to deploy, they're difficult to maintain, which is a big challenge in any microservices architecture, how we're going to maintain our services, how we're going to monitor them, aspects like that. So really, having that explicit boundary within a domain is really kind of the focus of what successful microservices really should be all about, rather than focusing on isolating our microservices too narrow with around a particular technology. Yeah.
Thanks, Will. Indeed, yeah, that's where we talk about the bounded context, right? Microservices should do only one job, and it should do that job right. So, uh, obviously, like I have seen cases where customer, try to refactor uh, a monolithic application, but they end up, say, for example, split it into three and call it as microservices as well. So that's not the
Yeah.
right approach. And obviously, in many cases, in monolithic, there will be a single database, and customer move to microservices, and they end up using the same database. They don't change the database structure at all, and they connect to the same backend, but they just now have the three different services and everything overwriting on the same database as well. So that's not the right practice to do.
No.
And indeed, just from your experience, Will, I mean, um, um, does customer usually get it right in the first attempt, or what's the effort involved in educating with the
Well,
right
to show a
mindset?
little bit of vulnerability here, in my first role, when I was starting out as a junior software engineer many years ago now, we were building an application using microservices, and we did exactly what you said. We had one data store and all these different services trying to interact with this particular data store. Um, and the performance of it, quite frankly, sucked because it was all they were all competing for the same resources for the database. Um, so when it comes to microservices architecture, people kind of they focus on the application code, and one of the big mistakes they make is not thinking about how data is going to interact with those different microservices. That's usually the big problem, as well as creating too many microservices so they can't manage them properly. Those are the kind of common mistakes that we see engineers make when they're starting their microservices architecture.
Sure. Well, yeah, indeed, good call out. And in many cases, right, when we talk about service fault isolation, etc., right. So this is one of the great pattern I can say. For example, if some of those microservices is not working, there is a graceful way to fall back without affecting the entire system as well, right? And indeed, when you specifically talk about the performance and databases, right? So I remember I had a customer scenario where a customer want to have, yeah, uh, high traffic financial application, and they have a low latency scenarios as well. Basically, credit card application where they swipe in, and within, say, for example, 300 millisecond or so, they need to have the end-to-end checks, and they need to either approve or reject the transaction as well, right? So in that case, like a customer was still trying to leverage the same database in the backend, and the performance at the end of the day was not great. The reason being that they were trying to do an atomic transaction synchronously, and in most cases, right, since we have a lot of components involved, there is a scope to, I mean, manipulate the performance, right? So, so in that case, like, customer was still trying to leverage the same database in the backend, and make it more asynchronous, which can increase the performance as well. For example, right? Uh, 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 Maybe we can push all the messages in a queue, and we can see a confirmation already, and then we can process it offline as well. So there are a lot of design patterns which we need to look into when designing a microservices. It's not just splitting the code. So that's
Yeah,
the key highlight that I want to check.
absolutely.
Yeah. So again, a lot of benefits which we talk about. Obviously, like there is a flexibility in choosing the own stack, etc. Some of the challenges, because whenever we have a lot of microservices, right, so the system complexity increases, and there is a overhead on the observability and how each microservices is going to interact with one another, right? It should be through the common API. So obviously we need an API layer for those ones. So and how are we going to update a particular microservices, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So, do you want to add anything specifically on that, Bill?
I
Any
think
thoughts?
the kind of guidance that I give to engineers when they're thinking about microservices is really, again, like I mentioned, think about your domain that you're going to build your microservices around. We see a couple of customers who I've worked with in the past. They have these monolithic applications, and they take kind of like a strangler approach. So they just don't break up the monolith right away. They identify domains and part of their monolith up front and say, okay, this would be a good candidate for a microservice. This is something that we can take out of the monolith and kind of refactor into a microservice using either Kubernetes or Azure functions. And they design it around the domain, because there may be a time where your domain in that particular business, you don't need it anymore. So by focusing your microservice designs around those different domains, it's easy to kind of decommission them when they no longer serve a purpose.
Awesome, awesome, Bill. Indeed, there are detailed guidance around how to do the domain analysis, domain-driven design. So obviously, feel free to explore these links. So this has detailed guidance and a typical scenario around one of the drone delivery application. How exactly you need to analyze the domain, and I mean, what might be the uh, domain model for this application, right? So try
Right.
to understand, and then obviously customer can filter on the domain driven design, and then further deep dive into, I mean, what are the tactical patterns they can leverage, and come up with a UML diagram on what exactly is the uh, uh, domain driven design which they want to leverage. So yeah, so while we might not be discussing end to end, I just want to call out that these are some of the very good references which you can go ahead and explore. And coming back, uh, there are a lot of options to host microservices. It depends on the platform as well. Azure Spring Cloud may be an option, and as Will pointed out, Azure Kubernetes Service or AKS is also an option as well. So that's when like containerization strategy comes in, right? So in most of the cases, right, each microservices can be converted into a container, and there are not common pattern everywhere, but yes, it's the mostly the common scenario as well. So um, this learn live module specifically talk about what a container is, particularly if we look at the learning objective, right? So how to look at containerization of the application. Again, microservices is one approach, but it's not like not all containerized applications are microservice application as well. So I just
Right.
want to set that straight.
Awesome. Cool. So just looking at the time, we've got about 10 minutes left. Shall
Yeah,
we move on to just a brief introduction to serverless?
sure. Well, yes.
Awesome. So if we share my screen again. Thank you. Awesome. So when we talk about serverless architecture, this kind of evolves around kind of pure cloud native code. And essentially, we're abstracting the code that we write from the infrastructure where it needs to run. Now, in Azure, we have Azure Functions, which is a serverless compute option that supports functions. So essentially, they're small pieces of code that kind of do a single thing. And the real benefit we get from serverless architectures using Azure Functions is that the infrastructure provided to us will automatically provide all the updates that applications need to keep running at scale. The compute and the resources that we use are allocated dynamically, and they instantly auto-scale to meet the elastic demands. It is important to point out that just because it's serverless, it doesn't mean no server. It's just that we're not responsible for the function. As developers, we're not responsible for the infrastructure that it's deployed on. It's essentially less server because servers only run as needed. In terms of costing, it's micro billing, so by charging only for the compute resources and the duration that the code is being executed for. And with functions, we can use bindings to actually streamline and simplify the integration by providing a declarative access, a declarative way to integrate with a variety of different Azure and third-party services. Functions are essentially event-driven, and these can be external events like HTTP web requests, messages coming onto a queue, perhaps we're running them on a schedule, and these will trigger our function code. Now, the application that we write in our functions doesn't code the trigger, but it's the response to a trigger. And so essentially what this does, by simplifying the integrations between our serverless, within our serverless functions, we can focus on our business logic rather than writing code to handle the infrastructure concerns like messaging. So in containerized applications, you'd have to figure out how to actually handle the concerns of messaging from Azure Service Bus, whereas with Azure Functions, we have defined triggers for that kind of handles that for us. Using serverless and functions, this actually requires new ways of thinking, and it's a different approach to building serverless applications. And as with all things, and a running theme throughout this session, is there aren't right solutions for every single problem. But we do have some general implementation steps and general guidance that we can use to actually help you decide or successfully implement your serverless technologies. So right from the start, you've got to decide and plan how you're going to develop your functions. So this is where your architects, your technical decision makers will actually do an assessment of your application, run some training and technical workshops with your developers to help them skill up and create proof of concept or pilot projects alongside those architectural design sessions to kind of design and plan your plan of attack for when you're developing your serverless technologies. And then once you have that in place, oh, sorry, go ahead, Satish.
So yeah, so just want to understand, Will, what type of use cases will be ideal for serverless versus other container-based approach, right? Sometimes customer might be confused in when to choose serverless and when not to choose serverless. Maybe if you can just talk.
So just coming back to the choosing this kind of like workflow, essentially the guidance that I give customers is when they have event-driven workloads and their processes are quite short-lived, Azure Functions is ideal for this because depending on how you're going to host your functions, they're not designed for long-running applications. Long-running applications. It's more short-lived processes reacting to events. And that's when you would opt for something like Azure Functions. Whereas if you do need those longer background processing applications, this is where we start talking about Azure Kubernetes Service or Azure Container Apps.
Thanks, Will.
Cool. And then once we've decided and planned out applications or planned our serverless applications, we will then start to develop and deploy it using those best practices and patterns, configuring our DevOps pipelines to ensure that our applications are going to be deployed securely and safely, and employ some site reliability engineering practices to ensure that once we've deployed our functions, that they maintain operational. And this is when we start moving into managing our functions, identifying how we're going to host them, how we're going to future-proof our scalability, because the demand that we experience during our POC and very early stages of our serverless applications might not be the demand that we would experience in the future. And functions are designed to handle that scalability, that elasticity and scalability. And then, as with all applications, we need to consider how we're going to secure our applications. Azure Functions is no different in this regard. We need to figure out how we're going to make sure that we're going to secure the traffic coming into our functions, how we're going to validate inputs to make sure that it's the input that we're expecting, and prevent our application of our functions being compromised by bad actors. Satish, do you have any final words on serverless before we kind of wrap up this session?
Yeah, so indeed, most of the time I get questions like, yeah, there is no good level of tooling support with respect to serverless. For example, the testability of the code, etc. Right? So again, I understand we are evolving, but what's your view on that tooling perspective, Will?
So I'm very much in favor of, because I'm a .NET developer by trade, so I love using Visual Studio to develop my functions. Some people, there is the option to kind of change and edit your functions within the portal. I'm a big fan of developing your applications and functions locally, making sure that you test them testing them properly and make sure they work as expected, and then put them through a pipeline using Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions to ensure that our functions behave as expected. We have good unit tests, we have good integration tests, we have those quality controls across our different environments. So if I'm deploying to a dev environment, that could be fairly straightforward. I just simply run a pipeline, it deploys to my dev environment. But as we move our function code into our production environments, I want to put those quality controls in place using Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions to ensure that function code behaves as expected and also is not going to be compromised by bad actors. I want to have that confidence that when we move our applications into productions, they're going to work as expected.
Awesome, Will. Thanks for that clarification.
And we have a lot of options when it comes to serverless technologies. It's not just Azure Functions. We can also use Logic Apps. So Functions is really a serverless compute service where Logic Apps provides us the ability to create serverless workflows. We can create complex orchestrations using both. In Functions, we would develop orchestrations using something called durable functions, whereas with Logic Apps, we would actually create our orchestrations either using the GUI or create editing configuration files. Awesome.
Yeah, just a quick time check, Will. Yeah, so we might be just 2 minutes away. So we would like to point out again other collection items they can explore, right? So we would like to point out.
So there's a lot of in this collection we've added some architecture deployment approaches using serverless. We've also got some design architectural guidance around AKS and Azure DevOps and how you can actually decompose your monolithic applications into a microservices architecture. Also choosing the best Azure service to automate your business process. So when we were talking about Azure Functions, serverless, we were focusing a lot on Azure Functions, but there's Azure Logic Apps as well. So that kind of helps you choose which service is going to be best for your scenario. And then we didn't have time to really touch on this today, but choosing a message model in Azure, there's an idea of events and messages, and it's very important to understand that from a developer perspective, and also choosing which data approach you're going to take in Azure. Cool, so I'm going to get my slides back up again. So just to kind of summarize, in this session, we learned about the 3 different approaches to migration and modernization. We also discussed how to choose the right Azure services to architect and modernize our applications, and also the tools that we can use to help along with our migration and modernization journey. And we discussed very briefly learning about different migration and modernization architectures. So thanks for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure talking to all of you today. Please have a look at the collection that we've created. There's lots of interactive exercises and reference architecture for you to digest. Satish, thanks for coming along this journey with me. It was great being able to talk to you today.
Thank you, Will. Indeed, it's a great conversation with you. And again, thank you for all the participants. Again, it's great conversation talking about the overall migration journey on Azure. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.